Li Bai, Clear and Bright Tunes number 2. One twig of red peony, scent captured in this pure night's dew. The clouds and rain of the lady of Mount Wu, sad for no reason. May I ask who in all the Han palaces could have been her match? Even less, Xiao Feijian in her finest makeup. So we continue with the second of the 3 poems of Li Bai, Clear and Bright Tunes, which, as we explained in the previous poem, were basically composed as a piece of flattery, and they were rather an impromptu composition, an improvisation in a state in which Li Bai was probably, deeply inebriated or under the effects of alcohol. So a very interesting improvisation in a piece of flattery on Jiang Guifei during a night revel in which the emperor summoned Li Bai to compose some poetry for the dancers. One clarification before we continue with this poem. Yesterday's poem had a reference to a many jades peak, to a Yushan, a jade mountain. It wasn't clear what mythological or literary reference was hiding behind that, but I've discovered now which it was, so it might interest you to know. So remember, we've talked a lot of times of the Queen Mother of the West, the Shi Wangmu, this lady, this goddess who lived in the remote bounds of the extreme West and sometimes received gods and emperors and other visitors and granted them immortality. Well, in the oldest legends, the Shi Wangmu lived in Yushan, in Jade Mountain. Not in the later legends, which are the ones I was more familiar with. In the late ones, she lives in the Kunlun Mountains in the presumed extreme West. But that reference to Yushan was a reference to the Queen Mother of the West. And again, this connects us with that imagery of goddesses who come and meet mortals, and especially emperors, and grant their favors on them as adequate metaphors for Our Lady Jiang Guifei's extreme attractiveness and beauty. And that's a topic that will continue in today's poem. Today's poem continues the ideas and the images of the previous one. So the topic of the poem, praise of Jiang Guifei. She is compared to the most beautiful flower in the world with the loveliest scent and perfume. And she's compared with goddesses, although the goddesses are put to shame because she surpasses the goddesses in her beauty. That is something that was not present in yesterday's poem. In yesterday's poem, we had this elegant confusion in which this beautiful woman, Jiang Guifei, could be easily taken to be an immortal, but in today's take, there's a one-upmanship on this trope with the idea that Jiang Guifei defeats the goddesses and the famous beauties of yore. Okay, so let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. So first couplet. One twig of red peony, scent captured in this pure night's dew. The clouds and rain of the lady of Mount Wu, sad for no reason. Okie dokie. So, the first one is the image that we encountered in yesterday's poem. It's Jiang Guifei equated to a flower. We may imagine that in this pavilion at the Imperial Palace, where some dancing is taking place and where the emperor is enjoying the company of Jiang Guifei and many dancers. There's also, it's a garden space and there's lots of flowers. And Jiang Guifei is being compared with the queen of flowers in Tang times, the peony. So the poem does not, it starts directly talking about a flower, but very evidently that flower is Jiang Guifei. And of course, she's a beautiful flower. Not only is she beautiful to the eyes, a twig of red peony, but she's also aromatic and so delightable to all the senses, including the sense of smell. And, the scent of this beautiful peony has been crystallized, congealed by this pure night's dew. So the dew has consolidated, retained, trapped the perfume around this beautiful red peony. And the same happens with Jiang Guifei. Incidental note, Tang people weren't too fond of bathing, but they were very fond of perfuming themselves. And, if you read the the documents, you find lots of recipes for substances that could be imbibed to make one smell well, or spread it over one's skin and so on. And of course, the palace ladies would be especially keen on doing this sort of thing. So, beautiful flower in the first line. The second line presents us a goddess, and more specifically, a goddess who is feeling jealous. The clouds and rain of the Lady of Mount Wu, sad for no reason. So, who is this Lady of Mount Wu? So, the Wu Shan lady was a goddess who appeared in a poem from, I think, from the late Warring States, early Western Han. I think the poet, I don't remember the name of the poet right now, and he was one of the famous early Fu poets from the state of Chu. Well, anyway, he has this poem which he wrote for his king, in which he describes a tryst in which the monarch, king of Chu, goes to a garden pleasant that he has outside the capital, close to Mount Wu Shan, and there he somehow manages, in an experience which is not explicitly described as a dream, so it might be a dream, a hallucination, or a real event, he manages to have a tryst with this beautiful goddess. Actually, I've just consulted now very quickly. Yeah, the poet is Song Yu, and the poem was a Fu, the Rhapsody on Gao Tang, which depicts the encounter of King Huai of Chu with a female divinity. The idea is that this king visited the Gao Tang shrine, and he dreamed of a woman who told him that he was the daughter of Mount Wu, and the king favored her with his bed. So this lady, Lady of Mount Wu, is sad for no reason. And this goddess is associated with clouds and rain, because when the clouds and the rain came, the goddess manifested herself. And also, later in Chinese literary tradition, clouds and rain became a very euphemistic way of referring to sexual intercourse because of this poem, this Gao Tang Fu. The idea that, because in that poem the goddess comes in clouds and rain and has intercourse with the emperor. Well, not the emperor, that was the king of Chu, sorry. Because of this image, future references to encounters with ladies and to clouds and rain are a very oblique reference to the consummation of love. So anyway, this is the first couplet. There's this beautiful lady who is like a peony and perfumed as well, and the lady of Mount Wu's clouds and rain, and the lady herself are feeling sad, apparently for no reason, but there is a reason, the implicit reason being that Jiang Guifei is even more beautiful than the goddess, and that she would beat her in any competition for the emperor's affection. This king has his goddess already at hand and will not go to Mount Wu to seek the lady dwelling there. Okay, the second couplet continues with this image with a slightly more secular tone. So in this case, instead of Lady of Mount Wu, we get a rhetorical question asking for the beauties of the historical, of the cultural past, with a very specific reference to the beautiful ladies of the Han Dynasty, and to one of them, arguably the most famous, or one of the most famous beauties during the Han Dynasty, Chao Feijian. So the couplet reads, may I ask, who in all the Han palaces could have been her match? Even less Chao Feijian in her finest makeup. So the idea is, so as I said, the poet makes those rhetorical questions. She says, out of all of the beautiful women in the world, out of all the beautiful concubines and consorts of rulers of yore, like in the Han Dynasty, is there any one of those beauties who dwell in the Han palaces, is there any that can compete with Jiang Guifei? And then also there is a very interesting contrast, because Chao Feijian, and this denotes also the changes in aesthetic tastes related to women. Chao Feijian was, I believe, very slender, very thin. Jiang Guifei, on the contrary, is a more chubby woman of the type that were favored in the Tang Dynasty, and as can be seen in extant paintings, you can see that Tang Dynasty women, without actually being Rubenesque, they had some meat in them. The men liked women with meat. And there is a famous Chinese idiom, in fact, with something like Huan Fei Yang Shou, which means literally plump Huan, slender Fei, to describe the range of different types of beauties. Anyway, so the third line, no lady from the Han Palace can compete with this lady, and even less than all those ladies, Chao Fei Jiang, in her finest makeup. So Chao Fei Jiang, she was a concubine, later an empress, I think, of Emperor Chang. And this is interesting. Remember, we've read poems that talked about Lady Ban. Well, Chao Fei Jian and her sister were the ones who displaced Lady Ban in the affection of Emperor Chang. And they were very beautiful, seductive women from a lower class background. And they besotted the emperor so much that the histories say he had the children that were born to him of other concubines executed, murdered, because they didn't want competition. And but she met a bad end. She had to commit suicide after the emperor died, and she became one of the repertoire of stereotypical wicked corruptresses, kingdom-toppling beauties, of which Chinese classical history has so many in list, and of which Zhang Guifei will also be one of the figures added to the list a few years after the poem that we're reading was composed. In fact, it became pretty conventional, I believe, to associate Chao Fei Jian and Zhang Guifei, and you could say that in this line, Li Bai is creating a precedent that will have a very long life. So, but anyway, going back to the couplet, it's just saying no beauty in past history, in dwelling in the palaces, can compare with you, and even less than all of those beauties, Chao Fei Jian, even in her most ravishing makeup and clothing and whatever. So as I said, a piece of very direct and explicit and unsubtle flattery of Jiang Guifei. Those anecdotes that talk about the events in which this poem was composed and the antipathy that the eunuch Gao Lishi experienced also go on to tell generally that based on, especially on the second poem, the eunuch convinced the emperor and Yang Guifei that Li Bai had actually been making fun of the lady in this poem, and comparing her to Chao Fei Jian was very inappropriate, even if it was a comparison of you are better than Jiang Guifei, you are better than Chao Fei Jian. Even comparing a woman to Chao Fei Jian was ominous. Like, it was hinting, Chao Fei Jian was of a low social background, and she was a bad wife for the emperor. In fact, some would have blamed her partially for the fall of the Western Han Dynasty. And in fact, this is what would happen with Jiang Guifei later on. So, well, that's interesting. Anyway, to conclude, I would like to read a couple of versions of this poem. Again, one taken from Ha Jin's biography of Li Bai, and that one reads as follows. The red peonies glisten with dewdrops. She stops others from pining for goddesses. Tell me, who was like her in the Han Palace? The pitiful flying swallow would resort to a new dress. Well, that's rather an effective version. I think, especially in the second line, it focuses on trying to transmit the concept instead of the literary message. Probably the translator is assuming that references to the goddess of Wushan would just darken the poem and make it quaint and exotic for the readership. So she stops others from pining for goddesses is probably a more direct way of transmitting what the second line is transmitting. The rest of the poem is pretty similar. First line doesn't mention the perfume of the peonies. Okay, but the last two lines are pretty similar. And finally, this is a version by Witterbinner. There's a perfume stealing moist from a shaft of red blossom, and a mist through the heart from the magical hill of Wu. The palaces of China have never known such beauty, not even Flying Swallow with all her glittering garments.